President. Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to speak for a few minutes today about the effort that we have undergoing right now with the Vice President and our colleagues in the House of Representatives to find a way to constrain spending, reduce our deficits and debt sufficient to warrant an increase in the debt ceiling, as the President has asked us in the Congress to do. We're told by the Secretary of Treasury that by around the first part of August, the United States will run up to the debt ceiling, and therefore Congress needs to pass legislation to extend that authority. Essentially, this is because financial commitments that the United States has already made can only be paid if we borrow money to pay those financial commitments, and therefore the debt ceiling would need to be increased. And members of both bodies and on both sides of the aisle have acknowledged that one of the primary things that we need to do at the same time that we raise the debt ceiling, if that is to be accomplished, is to ensure that we don't have to keep doing that in the future. That is to say that we don't keep piling on more and more debts by increasing spending in the future, so that certain things will be necessary at that time. Some constraints on future spending, some limitations on the ability of Congress and the President to pass additional appropriations for spending, for example. Setting limits on our budgets for at least the next couple of years so that we know exactly how much Congress would be authorized to spend. And, of course, those limits should take us back in time. They should not be increasing the amount of spending, but should actually result in reductions. Tackling entitlements. We all know that the big money is in entitlements like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and some other forms of what's called mandatory spending, spending that is committed to groups of Americans that doesn't require congressional action, but money that we know we're going to have to spend in the future, enormous sums of money in the trillions of dollars that if we're not able to trim in one way or another, or at least stop the increases in growth, we're not going to be able to afford those programs in the future and would therefore have to continue to raise the debt ceiling. Another question that's arisen is whether or not it would be helpful in this connection to raise taxes. I have said, and the Republican side has said, we will not raise taxes as a part of this exercise in extending the debt ceiling. Now, there may come a point in time later this year or next year where all of us would get together and engage in what some have called fundamental tax reform, or I like to call pro-growth tax reform, because I think a lot of economists believe that our tax code today is not conducive to economic growth, and that were we to make it much simpler and do things like reducing the corporate tax rate, for example, we could be much more competitive with our foreign trading partners. The President himself has made the point that we could reduce the corporate tax rate were we to eliminate what some have called loopholes and thereby reduce the amount of money that we have to collect through the tax rate itself. And this is a potential when we get into that kind of reform. But I want to distinguish the point here of rebalancing our tax code to get a pro-growth kind of tax code with the possibility of generating more revenues to deal with our debt situation. Those are two totally different situations. And while I would be very much in favor of taking a look at these tax expenditures, various subsidies, for example, to different groups, to see whether we could reduce some of those subsidies and thereby reduce tax rates in a revenue-neutral manner so that our tax code would be more conducive to growth, but in a revenue-neutral manner, meaning not in order to raise revenues, but in order to have a more sensible tax code so that we could be more competitive with our trading partners, for example. That's what the President, as I understand it, proposed relative to our corporate tax rate, which is the highest in the world today. And if we could get that rate down from 35% to 20 or 25%, we could be much more competitive with trading partners around the world. One way to do that is to reduce these so-called tax expenditures. Just give you an example or two. We have significant tax credits and deductions that are taken for the production of things like ethanol or for production of certain kinds of weather stripping equipment or solar energy equipment. This is an effort to promote so-called green energy. Well, those are pretty big subsidies. They are tax credits or deductions. They're called tax expenditures. Were some of those to be eliminated or reduced, then you could offset that increase in revenue with a reduction in the tax rate, still have as much revenue coming into the Treasury, but have a more sensible tax code. That's an example of what I'm talking about there. But let's contrast that with the situation on the debt ceiling question, because that's the one that's before us right now. We're going to have to act on the debt ceiling in the next couple of months or so. And the question is, how should we deal with our ballooning deficits and debt in order to warrant increasing the debt ceiling above what it is today? And the answer, of course, is to reduce spending, not raise revenues or increase taxes. I don't think anybody is suggesting increasing revenues by increasing tax rates. But some people have said, well, we can eliminate some of these loopholes or tax expenditures, and that's a way that we can collect more revenue. If a company can't take a certain credit or deduction, then it's going to have to pay more in taxes. And I want to make the point, no. If we're going to get into that kind of a discussion, we should do it in the context of reforming our tax code so that we can use those increased revenues in order to reduce the tax rates, as I said before, so that our country can be more competitive. That's the context in which we should be discussing the reduction or elimination of some of these so-called tax expenditures. Just in looking at this in an abstract way, and then I'll get more specific about numbers, our problem here is spending. We've increased spending so much more than it's ever been in the past that we're getting very, very deep in debt. To give a comparison here, over 25% of GDP, that's the amount that we're now spending here at the federal government level. Our historic level is just above 20% of the GDP. That is an enormous increase in the amount of spending by this country. Now, some will point out that the revenues collected by the Treasury are also down, and that's contributed to the deficit. And to some extent, that's true. But what are the reasons for it? It's primarily because of the recession that we have been in since the end of 2006, the decrease in the amount of money that individuals and businesses are making, and therefore a reduction in the revenues collected as taxes by the IRS. So revenues are down, but it's due to the recession that we have. We have not cut tax rates in the last few years, since 2006, for example. The last time that we had any kind of tax reduction was as a result of the 2001 and 2003 so-called Bush tax cuts. But we were generating a lot of revenue in this country before the recession. The recession has caused us to generate less revenue, both as families and as state and local governments and as the federal government. But CBO figures demonstrate that under any of the budgets that have been offered, including the Obama budget, we will be back to historic average levels of tax collections in just the next few years, something in the order of 20% of our gross domestic product. So the revenues are not the problem. They are going to be back where they have always been. Our problem is the spending. And as I said, the spending in this country is now above 25%. I misspoke a moment ago when I'm talking about collections. The tax collections in this country have averaged somewhere between 18 and 19% of our gross domestic product. The spending has been a little bit above 20%. So the revenues are going to get back up to that 18 or 19% under any of the budgets that have been suggested, the Ryan budget, the Obama budget, and others. The problem is spending. Under the Obama budget, spending never gets below 23% of the gross domestic product. In the Ryan budget, it goes from the 25% that we are today to below 20%. I think after 10 years in the Ryan budget passed by the House of Representatives, it's about 19.9% of the gross domestic product. So that's a way to get spending down to historic levels. Revenues will be back up to historic levels, and that's the way that we have both a vibrant economy and we produce the revenues that the federal government needs to operate without having to borrow 40 cents or 42 cents on every dollar as we have to do today. So when we're talking about how to get the budget better balanced, how to reduce our deficits, we shouldn't be looking at the revenue side or the taxing side. We should be looking at the spending side. And on spending, we know that the big money is in the entitlements, not the discretionary part of the budget. We need to, as a down payment, be looking in an order of magnitude of about $2 trillion here. Speaker Boehner has said that if the administration wants to increase the debt ceiling by $2 trillion, then we should show $2 trillion in savings. If it's $1 trillion, then let's make it $1 trillion. So far in our negotiations, we're only talking about a couple $100 billion. And we've got to get up to the trillion and $2 trillion level. And over the course of 10 years, we're going to have to at least double that to more than $4 trillion if we're going to handle the long-term debt problem. That's how big it is. Under the Ryan budget, the actual debt ceiling is increased by $5 trillion over 10 years. So we're not talking about slashing everything in half. We're talking about continuing to have to borrow more money to pay our bills. But under the Obama budget, the amount that we would have to borrow, in addition to what we have, is $12 trillion. So President Obama would be asking us to raise the debt ceiling by another $12 trillion. And that's not sustainable in this country. It's got to be more along the line of the Ryan budget, as I said. And that means that we're going to have to come up this year with at least $4 trillion, between, I would say, $4 and $6 trillion in savings in order to be able to bend this spending curve downward over time. That means at least a couple $1 trillion as a down payment, at least double that over this 10-year period, and that means a lot more than what, so far, our negotiations are talking about. And I don't doubt the goodwill of all of the parties to try to achieve that objective. But what I'm saying is it can't be achieved by just looking at discretionary spending. You've got to look at fundamental entitlement reform in order to achieve those kinds of savings. And for those who say, well, but that may change the Medicare program or it may change the Social Security program, two things. One, nobody's talking about changing any of those programs for anybody that's currently on them or even somebody who is going to be on them within a 10-year period of time. So we're not talking about people that are on Social Security or people who are even 9 years away from Social Security. And second, with respect to the benefits that are promised in these programs, understand that if we don't do something about them now, those benefits are not going to be there in 15 or 20 years. In fact, under Social Security, the law is that when it no longer has the money to pay the benefits stop. So this is not a matter of either keeping in law what we have right now or nothing. This is a matter of either fixing the programs now or having a dramatic reduction in benefits on down the road. That's why we need to tackle this issue now. But, Mr. President, one of the reasons I wanted to discuss this on the floor today is because there's some misunderstanding of comments that I made on television yesterday, and it's easy to, I think, misunderstand people when they talk about raising revenue in the context of dealing with a budget deficit, which Republicans are simply not going to raise tax rates in order to try to reduce this deficit with more revenue as opposed to savings. It's much different to talk about that than it is to say there are tax expenditures that we could deal with, and if we could eliminate those or reduce them, then we could also reduce our tax rates and make our tax code more competitive. That makes a perfect amount of sense. But I don't think we're going to be able to do that in the next 2 weeks. I think that will take, the next 2 months. My guess is it's going to either be done sometime later this fall or perhaps early next year before we're able to achieve that kind of bipartisan revision of our tax code, if we can even do it then. But I hope we can, because I think there's a recognition by a lot of folks that there are a lot of these tax expenditures which don't need to be in the code. They complicate the code, they pick winners and losers, and the more of those that we could do away with and thereby reduce tax rates for everybody, the better off that we would be. I'm hopeful that we will, through these bipartisan negotiations, be able to come together on significant savings. And the last point I guess I would make is that I would not be concerned, however, that the United States of America will ever default on our debt. We won't. The President's made it clear. The Secretary of Treasury has made it clear that we can. In fact, if you look at Article the 14th Amendment, Article 4 of the 14th Amendment, it says we can't. So I don't think any creditor should be of the view that somehow we're not going to pay them when their T-bill comes due. That's not going to happen. Nonetheless, it's not a good situation when the income of the government is less than the bills that we need to pay, because even though we may pay creditors, that may mean that, Mr. President, your paycheck and mine might be 2 weeks late or something like that, and I'm sure all of us would like to see our bills paid on time. But I think we can come together and even avoid that result if we're able to work together as both sides of the aisle and both bodies in the Congress have committed themselves to do. Mr. President, I notice the absence of a quorum.
Call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
I would ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that morning business be extended until 7 p.m. for debate only, with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to talk about a conversation I had in Baltimore this afternoon dealing with the high price of gasoline. I was talking with a station owner, and I mention that because the problems of the high price of gasoline have nothing to do with the station owners. These are small business owners. They're having a difficult time with the cash flow due to the higher cost to purchase their product. And they're also on the front lines getting the wrath of the consumers as they get the sticker shock when they fill up their tank. I can tell you that consumers are hurting today every time they go to a gasoline station to fill up their car. It's affecting their household budget. It's affecting our economy. And it will become even more dire as we go to the summer months, when more and more families will be deciding on their family vacations, and the cost of gasoline will very much figure into it, having a direct impact on our economy. But I can tell you a group of companies that are not hurting as a result of the gasoline price increase. And there are big oil companies. With gas prices escalating, oil profits have soared. There's a direct relationship, Mr. President. As our economy is suffering with higher gasoline prices, the profits of the oil companies go up. The 5 largest oil companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips, have seen nearly $1 trillion in profits, $1 trillion in profits over the last 10 years. In the first quarter of 2011 alone, the first quarter, first 3 months, they had a record profit of $35.8 billion. Now, when you compare that to a year ago, these companies have seen an increase in their profits, where American businesses are suffering, where household incomes are being stretched. The oil industry makes more money on higher prices of gasoline. Now, I'm for the free market economy. I hope businesses can make a lot of money. Hire more people, that's good. But that's not the situation with the oil industry. Most of their profits go to their stockholders and to repurchase shareholders' interests. It's not going to creating new jobs in America. Secondly, they're making these profits in part because of taxpayer subsidy. So the person who goes up to fill up his or her tank at a gasoline station is being affected adversely twice. First, by the cost of gasoline a day, and secondly, they're being asked as taxpayers literally to help subsidize the oil industry. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Now, in 2005, President George W. Bush said, and I'm going to quote, "I will tell you, with $55 oil, we don't need incentives to the oil and gas companies to explore. There are plenty of incentives." All end quote. Well, as you know, Mr. President, the crude oil price per barrel today is not $55. It's $100, and it's even gone higher than that. At the time, 2005, all of the big oil CEOs agreed that there was no need for subsidies with oil prices reaching $55 a barrel. Once again, today it's $100 a barrel. Now, we will have a chance later this week to consider legislation to eliminate these tax loopholes. Senator Menendez has introduced legislation, and we're going to have a cloture vote on that later this week. I want to talk about the largest tax provision that's involved in this legislation, Section 199. It's about $18 billion of taxpayer revenue involved in this. Let me just give you a little bit of history about the genesis of this tax provision. It was originally put in the tax law for foreign sales companies. U.S. companies that exported products overseas. For you see, a United States manufacturer is at a disadvantage from a foreign country manufacturer. If you manufacture your product in Europe or Asia and import it into America, you can take off from the imported price the tax, the value-added tax that's added in Europe and Asia. But if you're an American manufacturer and you're sending your products into Europe or Asia, and yes, there are taxes involved in producing the product here in America, you cannot take that tax off when you send that product into Europe. So we are competing on an unlevel playing field. American manufacturers are not in the same competitive advantage. Congress did something about that and passed a tax provision to give U.S. manufacturers who export products a tax break. That's what we did. Now, obviously, the oil industry didn't get that tax break. First of all, they're not what you would call traditional manufacturing. And secondly, they import a lot more than they ever export. They import all their crude oil, and the amount of their exported product is far less than that. But the problem happened after we passed this foreign sales provision. Companies in Europe and Asia took us to the World Trade Organization and said that this was an illegal subsidy to U.S. manufacturing. We argued, and I think the right position, that it was not, but we lost the case. As a result, we had to redo the tax provisions, and we passed what's now known as Section 199. And what we did is we did rough justice. We gave all manufacturing a certain tax break, figuring that it would be fair to deal with their manufacturing that was used for export. Now, I must tell you, I don't think any of us envisioned at that time that $18 billion of that revenue would go to the oil industry. They didn't need this break, and this is not a matter of subsidizing their products into the export market, when, as we know, petroleum and oil is a global product. So it makes no sense whatsoever to continue this tax provision for the oil industry. It should have been repealed a long time ago. But one thing is clear, it's not needed, that the profits of the oil industry is very, very high, and we need these revenues for other purposes. We need these revenues in order to deal with deficit reduction. I hear my colleagues on both sides of the aisle talk frequently about how we need a credible plan to reduce the federal deficit. I agree with that. We do need a credible plan to reduce the federal deficit. But if you don't start with getting rid of these tax expenditures that are clearly not serving any public purpose, we can't start with the easy things. How are we going to make the tough decisions? And we're being asked to tell our seniors they're going to have to do with less and students are going to have to pay more. Well, let me tell you something. The oil industry can do without this subsidy that they don't need. Now, I'm telling you, you're going to hear all types of scare tactics used by those who oppose this repeal. One of the common lines is that it will increase the price at the gas pump. Nothing could be further from the truth. I could just tell you the basic math here. Again, $140 billion in profits. We're talking about annually. That's annually. Projected to be $140 billion. The tax provisions here are about $4 billion on an annual basis. The numbers I was giving you before are 10-year numbers. So this is on an annual basis. And that last, I think, 2009, over 85% of the profits went back into the shareholders. So there's no possible way that it would have an impact on price. But let me just quote from some experts in this area. Severin Bernstein, the co-director of the University of California, Berkeley Center for the Study of Energy Markets, observes, and I quote, "Gasoline prices are a function of world oil prices and refining margins. The incremental change in production that might result from changing oil subsidies will have no impact, repeat, no impact on world oil prices, and therefore no impact on gasoline prices. And our own Congressional Research Service, and I quote, said, "In the recent market environment, prices are well in excess of costs." Repeat again, prices are well in excess of costs, and a small increase in taxes would unlikely to reduce oil output and hence increase petroleum product gasoline prices. So let me just put that myth aside. Now, one of the things I think all of us are concerned about is how do you bring down gasoline prices? You know, I've been told, will this tax, eliminating it, bring down gasoline prices? No, not in and of itself. It won't. But I tell you what it will do. It will give us all the tools that we need in order to move forward with energy policies in America. We're going to be asking for budget priorities to deal with energy independence so that we can bring down energy prices. So we've got to get rid of these unnecessary tax expenditures so we can have a budget that makes sense and is fiscally responsible. And yes, there are things that we can do to help bring down gasoline prices. We can certainly regulate speculation in the commodities market, the Commodities Future Trading Commission, give them the tools that they need. It's interesting, some of my friends on the other side of the aisle want to cut their resources. We think they should have the resources in order to get their job done. It's time that we take on the monopolistic policies of the countries that produce oil. These are countries that many of which are really not what you would call at all free economic countries. They are manipulating price and supply. We need to do a better job of taking that on. We need a comprehensive energy policy. I've said many times on the floor, America has a little over 2% of the world's reserves of oil, and we consume 25% of the world's oil. We've got to get off of oil. We've got to get off of imported oil. The only way we do that is develop alternative renewable energy sources, use less energy, so our nation can become energy independent. Mr. President, that will not only help us as it relates to the current economic problems, it will also help us create more jobs in America, will make us more energy secure, and will also help our environment. But the first step is to repeal the unwarranted taxpayer subsidies to the big oil companies. Let me close by quoting from an editorial that appeared in my local paper, the Baltimore Sun, on Friday, this past Friday, May 13th. I'm just going to quote a small part of it. What? Tens of billions of dollars in potential profits isn't good enough without the government adding some kind of sweetener to your $100 barrels of black gold? That's just greedy. And with the nation facing a debt crisis, it's downright immoral. To be talking about trimming Medicare and Medicaid, basic health care for our seniors and the poor, while preserving tax breaks that cost the federal treasury $21 billion is just beyond the pale. Mr. President, I agree with the editorial in the Baltimore Sun. It's well past time that we end these taxpayer subsidies. We're going to have a chance to do it this week. The first vote will be on cloture, whether we want to take this issue up for a vote up or down. I don't think this is terribly complicated. I think this is an issue that the American people expect us to take a stand on an up or down vote. I hope my colleagues will support the consideration of Senator Menendez's bill to repeal these tax subsidies and vote to repeal these subsidies so that we can help the American taxpayers and work together to develop an energy policy to make America secure so that we can have stable energy costs, including reducing the cost of gasoline at the pump, which is affecting every one of our constituents. With that, Mr. President, I would notice an absence of a quorum and yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka?
consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the Senate is expected to take up a bill that would repeal $20 billion in outdated, antiquated tax breaks for the oil and gas companies. In many cases, this tax break was created about a century ago. and they have little, if anything, to do with modern job-creating energy policy. Mr. President, it's time for them to go. These oil and gas tax breaks, they are targeted in this bill that we're going to vote on. They are narrow special interest tax subsidies that distort the marketplace. It happens to pad the profits as a result of the tax breaks, and it does nothing to keep gas prices down. It simply doesn't make any sense to me that we would continue to rely on oil and gas tax breaks that were originally written in 1916. These rules are truly vestiges of another era. And in some cases, rather than encouraging energy independence, the tax breaks actually promote energy dependence on the OPEC oil-producing member states and other foreign countries that produce oil. For example, there's a part in it called the dual capacity provision, and it allows major oil companies to claim a foreign tax credit for royalties paid to foreign governments. Now, the foreign tax credit was never intended to offset royalty payments. It was originally intended to offset foreign income tax payments. So a company does business in a foreign country, they pay an income tax. The tax code was created so that you could offset for their American income tax and use as a business deduction that foreign income tax payment. But what has happened is that the oil companies have twisted that and are claiming that that is like an income tax that they've paid to a foreign government. It isn't. It's a royalty payment. The tax code was never intended for that, and here is another loophole in our tax code that does nothing more than promote reliance and dependence on foreign oil and, for that matter, foreign governments. Now, that's exactly what we ought to be reversing, just from a national security standpoint. Not even to speak of the threat to our national economic condition, because we are now importing 70% of our daily consumption of oil from foreign shores. In addition to repealing those kind of tax subsidies, we also need to close a loophole that allows oil companies to claim a tax break for their own irresponsible actions. Turns out that BP has figured out how to shift nearly a third of their cleanup and legal cost of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill onto the backs of our American taxpayers. Now, here's what they've done. They've come out with a projection of future income and profitability in a report that came out. They expect that they're going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 billion of payments that they're going to make as a result of their irresponsible action of having this huge Deepwater Horizon Macondo oil well spill. Part of that, of course, is payments to local governments. Part of that is payments through the Gulf Claims Facility Fund. Part of that's going to be a hefty fine that's going to be imposed by the federal government. Well, very cleverly, they have gotten their tax lawyers together and they figured out that what they can do is claim that as an expense, a deduction, and save themselves $11.8 billion in taxes. what BP is treating its cleanup and its legal expense as an ordinary and necessary cost of doing business. These costs aren't ordinary business expenses, and they should not be tax deductible. And so when the 5 oil company CEOs were in front of our finance committee, I asked the CEO of BP, I said, are you going to do this? And he said, that's what the law allows, that's what we're going to do. And I said, well, what the law allows doesn't make it right. I said, why don't you take a cue from the Boeing Company or from Goldman Sachs for the expenses they incurred as a result of untoward activity. They voluntarily did not employ this part of the tax code to use it as a business deduction and therefore to cut their taxes. And of course, when a company like this cuts their taxes nearly $12 billion, guess who makes up the difference? The rest of us do, us American taxpayers. So I've filed a bill, Mr. President, the Oil Spill Tax Fairness Act, and it aims to reduce the deficit by billions of dollars by preventing oil companies from shifting the cost of oil spills onto our taxpayers. In the past, Congress has stepped in to prevent unconscionable tax deductions for expenses such as civil and criminal fines, bribes, lobbying expenditures, political contributions, excessive executive compensation. We've done that in the Congress by passing laws to prevent those as tax deductions. Well, we ought to step in and do it again. BP, I think anybody would say, was irresponsible and negligent to the detriment of a whole lot of people. And the company should not be able to claim tax savings for their missteps. And especially so, this is just pouring salt on the wound while our people are being squeezed at the pump every day because of the price of gasoline at the same time that in the first 3 months of this year, the first quarter, those 5 oil companies had $35 billion in profits. I mean, how much more flagellation can the American taxpayer take? Today's rising gas prices reflect more than just record profits for the oil companies. There's also rising demand in Asia. It's clearly clear that our oil and energy markets are no longer governed by just supply and demand. Speculation, Mr. President, is back with a vengeance. We saw the handiwork of speculators 2 years ago when the price of oil hit an all-time high of $147 a barrel, only to plummet 80% of that price just a few months later. That's not supply and demand. That's not the working of the economic market. That is in part caused by speculators running the price of oil up, and then because they had to drop their positions on the Commodities Futures Trading Commission and the exchanges, they started dropping all of those futures contracts in oil. Now, speculators are using the turmoil in the Middle East and North Africa as an excuse to drive the price of oil sky high. And it makes no sense that we continue to let these commodities exchanges self-regulate by setting their own margin levels and other rules. Last year, when we passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, Congress empowered that commission that I just mentioned, the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, we empowered them under the new law to rein in excessive speculation so that commodities markets don't fly off the rails. Yet, this same commission has yet to finalize new rules to impose speculative position limits, which are the amount of money that you have to put down in order to buy these oil futures contracts. There are a number of us who have been working for months in this Senate to push the CFTC to act. The law we passed was clear, and it's time for the federal regulators to follow through. And, Mr. President, sadly, I want to recall a little over a year ago something that a lot of us remember so vividly. Many people can't forget the images of the oil that was gushing from 5,000 feet below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. In my public service, for decades, I've warned about the dangers of drilling out there in the Gulf. It's now unbelievable that almost a year after the Gulf oil spill and all of the environmental disaster that occurred as a result of this, folks are still now talking about being willing to risk the economy of the entire Gulf Coast again. You remember that 11 people died because safety took a back seat to expediency and profit. And so last week, the House passed 3 bills that would speed up oil production in a way that ignores serious safety concerns. And now Senator McConnell has a similar proposal, and these bills would require the Secretary of the Interior to approve or deny drilling permits within a maximum of 60 days. And if the Secretary doesn't take action within that time, a permit is deemed improved. That's like saying a home buyer, if they are not approved for financing within 60 days, they automatically get the financing regardless of their credit. Or it's like saying if a prisoner doesn't hear back from the parole board in 2 months, that prisoner is going to be automatically out on parole. Let me stop right here, Mr. President, and ask my colleague, the great and distinguished senator from New Hampshire, if I may be allowed by unanimous consent to continue and finish, and I think I can be done in about 2 or 3 minutes. I thank the senator from New Hampshire. Well, it's simply irresponsible to deregulate an inherently dangerous activity in this manner. And it's a slap in the face to the commercial fishermen, the hoteliers, and the small business owners on the Gulf Coast who to this day have not been made whole. And yet, these bills are out here. The House passed it. Senator McConnell's bill would roll back the Department of Interior's post-Deepwater Horizon revisions to offshore leasing, revisions that came about because of what we learned from the oil spill. And Senator McConnell's bill seeks to limit the fundamental right of Americans, and that's access to the courts. His bill would not allow Floridians who want to file a civil lawsuit regarding any offshore energy projects in the Gulf of Mexico to have a claim near their home in Florida or their place of business in Florida. Instead, under his bill, they have to go to the Fifth Circuit. That's Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Now, why should people from Florida have to file a claim there? Why can't they go through the 11th Circuit, which is the one for the state of Florida and Georgia? The Fifth Circuit certainly can't be the only circuit with expertise on the subject of offshore energy. I believe we have a responsibility to protect access to the courts, and Senator McConnell's bill jeopardizes that for the people who do not have the luxury of going far off to another state to bring a lawsuit. And so, meanwhile, the House has passed a bill last week that seeks to open, now it's getting personal, they seek to open the eastern Gulf of Mexico off of Florida. That which Senator Martinez and I have off limits in law. Obvious reasons we have it off limits in law. It's the largest testing and training area for the United States military in the world. We have 2 letters from 2 successive secretaries of defense, including the present one, Secretary Gates, that says you can't have oil drilling and related activities. They use the word, it is incompatible with the military training and testing mission. That is the largest training and testing area for the U.S. military in the world. It's the Gulf of Mexico, basically off of Florida. And of course, you all have heard me over and over talk about all the dry holes. There's not much oil out there off of Florida. The oil is where the Lord intended the oil to be, and that was, for years, the sediments coming down the Mississippi River and then being compacted, and then millions of years, the compacting of the Earth's crust has formed that oil. That's off of primarily Louisiana, some off of Mississippi, some off of Alabama and Texas, not Florida. So the proponents of these bills claim they'll lower gas prices. At the same time, the oil and gas companies are making billions of dollars. Just look at their first quarter report. And we're giving big tax subsidies to the oil companies. Mr. President, the price of oil dropped $17 last week. It was the largest weekly decline in over 2 years. But you know what? I don't think the folks at the gas pump saw a commensurate drop. I think it's about time that we gave them some relief. And we're going to have a chance to do that. Now, Mr. President, I conclude by saying that we're not fooling ourselves. To be able to get an individual bill like this for an individual tax break, however objectionable that tax break is, it's going to be difficult to get 60 votes to break a filibuster. But, Mr. President, help is on the way. There's a group called the Gang of Six. They're meeting, and they're trying to put together a package to solve our deficit crisis and to make real progress over the next decade or so as we move toward budget balance, a condition that we enjoyed as recent as 2001. Not only budget balance, but a budget surplus. And so it's my hope that when we get down to putting this package together of how we're going to lower the deficit, that people of goodwill will come together and recognize there are things in the tax code that have got to be changed to make them right. I have enumerated but a few here today, Mr. President. And with that, I yield the floor, and I look forward to the comments of the very distinguished senator of New Hampshire.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
I'm pleased that I could